of old people can't stay the whole time. It's quite normal. That
yeah, I told him that. Don't worry.
Yeah, and I've spoken to humanist groups up and down the country, and I know the score. We had a meeting Friday before last, I think, and by coincidence it was on the same day that Varsi was giving a speech to the OIC that we mentioned earlier, the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation. So it was interestingly timed, and yes, as you say, it was a successful meeting because the FCO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, were pleased to talk to us, and I think you can tell when they're really pleased or not. And they're very much, I think those staff that we met were very much on side, understood the importance of the belief element in freedom of religion or belief. Obviously, I mean, it's their job to understand that stuff. Varsi's speech on that day to the OIC was very positive from our point of view. It kind of said, when you're talking about religious tolerance and so on, it's no good meaning only that for your particular brand of Islam. You need to mean that for everybody, non-religious and otherwise. And she was sort of very positive. So we kind of took that, and I think sometimes the right thing to do is to take some glimmer of positive change and really big it up, because if you make a thing of it and say, look, Varsi has totally changed and backed this idea, she understands some notion of a secularist idea of what freedom of religion or belief should mean, then that means it's out there, and she can now be held to account against it, even if you've slightly, uplifted the version of what she's said. And then a few days afterwards, she was speaking somewhere else, and she said, the reason I care so much about freedom of religion or belief is because of all the good stuff religious people do. And you went like, she's completely undermined a big chunk of what she said the other day. But I think it's still important to sort of recognise incremental steps, even if a lot of the good stuff is coming from the department rather than from her personally. Yeah, I mean, it was a positive meeting. I think we've said publicly we're going to meet with them more regularly. They had met with the National Secular Society a couple of years ago, but they weren't regularly meeting with them, and they're not regularly meeting with anyone giving a humanist or secularist perspective from an international view. So the VHA and IHEU will be meeting every other month or so with them, and we're going to comment on some of the resources they already have. So it's a very good situation. It's similar. The American Humanists have got some leeway into their similar sort of office equivalent, and the Canadians have just lost out on. They've been excluded from a new Office of Freedom of Religion that's just been created, and they're complaining against that and will contest against it. But you can see similar relationships elsewhere that faring better or worse, and we're now on the upside.
Okay. Any questions to? Okay. Oh yes, sorry. James just reminded me, because we're videoing this. If you are concerned, the video is only pointed at Bob, probably me. But if you're concerned that your question shouldn't be on the video, just speak to James and he will censor it before publication. Okay. Any? Yes. So one here, and then we'll go over to America. Yes.
Yes.
Thanks, James.
I appreciate the talk very much. Very interesting to hear what's going on. What I didn't really get a clear picture of it is the kind of scale of what's going on in, say, Uganda and possibly elsewhere. I mean, difficult to get whether it's a sort of voice crying in the wilderness almost, or whether it is quite a significant movement. So, I mean, is there anything you could say about the kind of membership you've got and that sort of thing?
Because of that different structure it has, like it doesn't have individual members joining. There isn't the kind of disposable income in the population that you could have, like the BHA, like 12, 15,000 members, whatever it is, individually joining. And there isn't that tradition of sort of fundraising from a national basis. There are certainly, all told, there are some dozens or hundreds of people involved in all those separate projects I talked about. And some of them are very substantial with property, like the schools or offices. Others have got cheap offices and work from there. It's certainly, I mean, it's an NGO, and I think, yeah, there are some dozens of people involved. There are lots of different people sponsoring them, and you saw the number of different projects that are there. And but that's what the schools is. There's 4 schools, so it's not like having 100 schools. It's not like having 1 school. I mean, certainly in terms of its wider social impact, their focus in Uganda has very much been on these welfare and education projects, and it may be that over time that starts to ripple out, and people, you know, some of those students in those schools are now humanists, right? Some of those students have taken on board what's been said. They're not trying to indoctrinate the children or whatever, and you can't sort of take a whole school of children in a predominantly Christian area and tell them all that their religion is wrong just off the bat, something like that. But there will be a sort of ripple effect from that. But in other countries like Malawi and Nigeria, the work has been more about kind of campaigning on particular issues. Malawi has just been funded to an incredible tune by the Norwegian embassy in Malawi, and they're going to sponsor a massive program on exactly the stuff I was talking about with the witchcraft abuse cases. So they call it witchcraft-based violence. And through that work, by saying that this is the humanist response to these witchcraft accusations and to this notion of sorcery, here's a more empathetic and critical way of thinking about it. That has come out into the media, and George Thindor, who runs the Malawi Humanists, is recognised as a humanist who will appear in the media and is attacked for being a humanist and so on, just like Leo is in Nigeria. So they're different approaches working different ways. In some ways Uganda is much bigger because it has more of these projects. In some ways though, probably more newspaper reading people in Malawi will have heard about humanism because that's been their focus. But they're different approaches, and we see that everywhere. You know, the French groups affiliated to IHEU are very different from the kind of, they're more laïque than the humanists in, say, Britain or America, and this is just a slightly different focus on what they're doing. But overall, sorry, I know I'm now leaving the question behind, I know, but so there's difference of approach around the world. Although there's a difference in emphasis, I think there's very much a shared idea of what humanism is. So to compare, for example, the Church of England here to the Church of Uganda in Uganda, where they're both members of the Anglican Communion, but they're basically unrecognisable. Like the church there is so much more Pentecostal. It's a sort of magical realist fantasy church that the Church of England has to some extent moved away from. And I don't think humanism has that kind of discrepancy. When we talk about human rights and ethics and freedom of religion or belief, that they mean the same thing in Brazil and Uganda and India. And it's only the emphasis on what the problems are locally and what the approach is, and often it's just about the individual personalities. Do I want to do lobbying work, public affairs work? Do I want to build schools and do welfare and education type work? That's sort of the shape, but the overall humanist element, I think, is remarkably similar around the world. We're all talking the same language, although we're not, obviously.
Thanks, Bob. Maren?
I just want... I can shout. I just wondered why things have been so slow off the mark in South America. What were the sort of blocks there to humanism, and why is it starting now?
I think from an organisational point of view, the main block is Portuguese and Spanish, and that's a big part of obviously the sort of spread of organisations. Is you need a sort of critical mass of resources before you have enough people speaking enough languages. So that's probably why it's been easier to go into sub-Saharan Africa, where we managed to spread a lot of English before. But I mean, now there are big demographic changes as well. I think it's only recently that we've seen a huge shift away from Catholicism in Brazil. So, like, definitely the biggest percentage of the Catholic Church is in South America rather than any other continent. But the number of non-religious people is increasing. The demand, the understanding of secularism is there. So there's a sort of cultural purchase to latch onto as well. But it's certainly one of the things on my long to-do list is to increase the sort of diversity of languages in which we're publicising ourselves as an organisation.
I'm sorry,
behind you, John.
you've partly answered it. Can you hear me?
Well, it's better with the microphone though, because then the sound comes towards the camera.
It's on. You partly answered the question I was about to ask, but it's fundamentally about the balance of the organisation in terms of world geography. I looked at the list of organisations, for example, that you're represented on.
The UN bodies.
Yeah, but the bulk of them are in Europe. And although you have 129 member organisations, could you tell us how many of those and what the strength is of the European, or if you like, Western Hemisphere influence is? And the second part of the question is the one that you've touched on. It's a kind of personal obsession, because having been very much involved in international organisation for workers' education for a long time, what was always a problem was language, especially as we began to move into Latin America, where we forget how important languages like Portuguese are. Our executive committee, which theoretically covered the world, of about 15, 18 people, everything was conducted in English. Even though I was, some meetings, the only native English speaker in the group, even though it might have been slightly moderated by a mild Scottish accent. But apart from that, this always seemed to me a real difficulty, partly because if you only use basically one language, even though people are relatively fluent in it, unlike the British, who are terrible at languages, absolutely awful, you use English, you bring something of that culture, the nuances of meanings of words, even like democracy, rights, and so on. And it's very difficult, I think, to move across the range of people that you want to engage. And is that what's happening? Because I know, obviously, it's extraordinarily expensive to have constant simultaneous translation and so on. So how do you cope with that one?
So some of our events, especially we hold a World Congress every 3 years, where there tends to be, so there's a bigger version of the annual General Assembly that we have. So every year we hold a General Assembly alongside a national conference, and that we try and move that around. But yeah, obviously it tends to be in countries where we already exist, and as you assumed rightly, there's those linguistic barriers to moving further afield, partly cultural barriers, and yeah, I mean, the IHEU grew up in Europe and North America, and is going to be sort of linguistically and culturally skewed in that direction. And so we make efforts to try and move beyond that with the resources that we have. I mean, I tried to sort of give a picture with that big map and, you know, say, you know, when I talk about the London office, I mean me and Colin, yes, attached to the British Humanist Association office. It is a very thin umbrella. It's more than just a hook off which to hang the UN accreditation. It's got these, you know, 100 plus members and big national members. So all told, the sort of people that are members of the national organisations that then affiliate to us are very large. But yeah, we're, I suppose, like the UN itself, there's a sort of cultural bias there that you try and fight against by reaching out. And obviously, you know, they've got a lot more money to do that with than we do. To come back to you mentioned the executive committee, and yeah, we're in very much the same issue there. I mean, one problem we have is that because we're managing with quite few resources, we're funded by essentially sort of very complicatedly calculated subscriptions from members. So depending on their circumstances, their membership, their income, and so on, they give some small portion of their total annual income to the IHEU, but it's quite small. And so it means the executive committee tend to a large extent, they're flying around the world and they have to pay for that themselves. So it's that sort of issue that again totally restricts membership to some extent. And we're trying to find ways around things like the language barriers and the access barriers of financial necessity. I mean, one big focus for us has been India, where we have an incredibly populous country. English, obviously, not the first language, but does have that that colonial history, I suppose, that has made it the auxiliary language. And yeah, whatever language you talk in, I think you're right. There are some sort of cultural connotations and so on that come with a given language. I'm not sure. A very personal and completely anthropological view is that I think we sometimes over-exaggerate it, and people say like the Eskimos have got 1 billion words for snow and so on. I don't really. Language moderates things quite a bit. The metaphors we use are different. There's a South American tribe, I think, that talks about time instead of as a sort of line like we talk about it. They talk about it as going up the mountain and where the sun is on the mountain, because the entire language has grown up around like a particular geological feature. That's sort of interesting, but I don't think that it fundamentally moderates things. And I think it's certainly preferable if your conference can be in English as opposed to being in so many different languages that no one can understand each other. But we, at the congresses especially, we try and have some simultaneous translation, as you discussed. It'd be interesting to see over the decades ahead whether we all end up speaking Chinese or Arabic or English or whatever. But I mean, we're certainly seeing that, I think, slowly over time. The whole globe is sort of homogenizing linguistically. It was really interesting in Uganda to see people, English, obviously it's a sort of common auxiliary language, so people in the south are speaking Luganda, people in the north are speaking Acholi, but English has sort of come across the whole country, but only if you were educated enough for long enough. And it's now most people can speak at least some of it, but certainly not lots of rural areas and so on where they'll only speak their local tribal or regional language. But obviously, I mean, it would be much harder for Uganda to function for a country if it was still speaking 60 tribal languages, and now it's got that auxiliary language, and it's become the language of formality and business. So I noticed that the maids in the hotel I stayed in when I first got into Kampala for a few weeks, they spoke to each other in their local language, probably Luganda, but they spoke to their superiors, their bosses, who ran the hotel, in English, even though they both understood Luganda, because it was a more formal relationship then.
Thank you.
I got off the point a bit there.
Thank you very much for an interesting discussion. I wondered to what extent you were able to use literature or stories that could be performed on radio or perhaps plays on television to get the humanist message across. It can be a very powerful method of propaganda in the form of fictional accounts of what's going on. And I wondered to what extent you can actually sponsor these or encourage people to write stories from a humanist perspective.
It could certainly be encouraged. I think the most efficient way of getting sort of messages out there is press work. And that's as true here as it is in sub-Saharan Africa, is that's one way of getting your message out. I think using fiction and story can be great, but it's very expensive to get on the radio and to get onto telly, and it's certainly in a country where you're coming against a sort of a very, very dominant religious culture. It can be very hard. To speak about something Uganda-related that I obviously wasn't involved in at all, there was that recent case of an English chap who's been working at the university in Kampala for some years and has a Ugandan wife and children and so on. And he ran, I guess, like a sort of Amjam, I think, a local theatre production of a play, a British play that was about some Ugandan workers that realise their boss is a homosexual and decide to kill him. So he was essentially trying to do that, to use the story and a medium that people could talk about and go see this play. And he's now been deported from the country as an undesirable person. And obviously, he's not undesirable at all. He worked at Makerere for some years. He's a long-standing expat in Uganda. So there's a lot of barriers to doing that. I mentioned this, but I agree with you completely about the power, and it's very desirable to do it. One story that is shown again and again and again on TV in Uganda is you get these, often I think Nollywood, like the Nigerian films, where they're sort of really underfunded badly made sort of dramas that are film length, made for TV stuff, filmed with like one camera, and there'll be a plot about neighbours and drama and so on, but the plot will revolve fundamentally around the idea that sorcery is real. So whereas I might go and make a film and say, look how awful it is that something bad happened in this village, and now people have blamed this vulnerable old lady and called her a witch, and now they've persecuted her, and then they've killed her, and look how awful that is. Their film revolves around exactly that story, except they kill the witch, and she disappears at the end in a shower of magical sparks of a terrible special effect. So it reinforces. So the message isn't don't kill people as witches. It's you better kill the witches because they really are responsible for these deaths and so on. So it's very powerful, and because they're shown just again and again on the television. I mean, you know, weirdly because we live in the world that we do, they're shown on. You can subscribe to Sky Channel and get Graham Norton's chat show, Will and Grace, BBC News, and these awful Nollywood dramas, all on the same service, but they're promoting the idea again and again and again that this is real. They're filmed as if they're almost sort of documentary style, and they're very destructive. So it would be great if we had the money, yeah.
Yes, you do.
Yep.
Oh, have you managed to make any progress in somewhere like Saudi Arabia that they just don't understand the concept of democracy? And the other place I worry about is the United States, where they're very much against non-believers. I remember the programme that Dawkins did when you went over there, and he nearly lynched him.
In the United States, I mean, there's an American Humanist Association. There are various secular and humanist groups, and we have various members there. And I think actually in the last few years, partly as a result of Dawkins' own push, actually, there has been a sort of marked increase in talk about atheism and the tolerance that comes with that, and the backlash that comes against it as well. I would say that things are on the up in one sense in the US, but obviously there's the sort of extreme Christian right rhetoric that, especially around election time, gets worse and worse. And but overall, I think it's probably easier than it was 10 years ago in many parts of the States. This is from my obviously completely remote. I haven't lived in these States or anything like that. I think it's probably slightly easier. Saudi Arabia, yeah, I mean, obviously it's in the report. I mentioned the Freedom of Thought report. It's not possible to register a humanist organisation or a secularist organisation in Saudi Arabia. And yeah, Hamza Kashgari was the example I gave of the poet who's in prison for blasphemy. In some ways, there's been very little progress. I think one thing we've seen recently, in some way, a bit like the Rum Shamasi case. So Rum Shamasi in Pakistan was the girl, the Christian girl, 14, 15, with some form of learning difficulties, who was, the local cleric said she's burned the Quran. This was the same cleric that was on record many times saying, wouldn't it be great if there was something we could rally around in our neighbourhood to get all the Christians out? And lo and behold, he found the girl that had supposedly burned the Quran, and his own staff in the mosque said, no, it was him, he planted the papers. So in Pakistan, that had this effect for really the first time in a long time. There was a big domestic backlash against this case. And Rum Shamasi became one of the first people for a very long time to actually get to the point of going to court. She had a court date, she went through this whole process, and eventually her case was dismissed. That just doesn't normally happen. Normally, once you get to court and they want to press charges, that's it, you're definitely going down for blasphemy. And people were just, many senior clerics and things who believe that blasphemy is a real thing, believe it should be a crime, came out and said, this girl should not be on trial for blasphemy, it's clearly a malicious accusation. And they talk about misuse of blasphemy, and we say, well, it's always misused. In Saudi Arabia, to come back to your question, a couple of weeks ago, there was a case with a TV cleric who was accused of, and presumably did, murder and torture his own daughter. And he was let off by the court with blood money. So he essentially just had to pay a fine to the mother of the girl, who was also, you know, it was his girl, and he had to pay blood money to the mother. And that caused a big backlash. And so I think organisationally, we certainly haven't made much progress in Saudi Arabia. There are contacts, individuals. But I think one thing that we're seeing in lots of countries that are that present a huge barrier, a huge edifice to critical thinking and to humanism, is that there are sort of back channels opening up. Like the backlash against this cleric in Saudi Arabia grew on Twitter, grew via a hashtag, which has become such a cliche, but it really does seem like social networking and the ability for people to talk to each other without going through the authorities, without going through state-controlled press and so on, does allow people to slowly sort of chip into some of these bulwarks that are so hard to get into. So there's the tiniest, obviously in this case something awful has happened, that there's a tiny glimmer of something not positive coming out of it, but a backlash against it. And hopefully when these things do occur, we will incrementally see more of a negative response from local, from domestic organisations and from local people.
On a similar note, I was just thinking that obviously in the UK that we have a lot of freedom to speak, and the non-religious do get a reasonable good hearing, although we may argue that it's a little biased sometimes in the amount of air minutes given to perhaps the religious speakers over the likes of Andrew Copson and stuff sometimes, but in theory we get a reasonable balanced thing, and there's a little bit of argument of aggressive or militant secularism, but generally speaking we don't get a lot of backlash. But in somewhere like Uganda, where you look at sort of the naming and shaming of gay people in newspapers, and a very aggressive media against what is not, well, what not the perceived norm or accepted way of life, does something like your organisation come under a sort of aggressive media against the sort of non-religious or secular? Obviously in any country as well, but Uganda is just a good example.
Yeah. The Uganda humanists have had some problem as humanists. One of the schools, for example, was they bought land for the school and built the school and tried to recruit students for it, and they first had a problem because there was a sort of myth in the local area that the hill was a haunted hill, and so they had first of all to try and disabuse people of that idea, and then someone locally sort of made the connection and said it's a humanist school, that means atheism and godlessness. So now it was a godless school on a haunted hill, and that sort of thing is there sort of lurking in the background, but it's nothing like as malicious as the stuff against gay people can be. And I think the biggest issue they've had in terms of being maligned in the press was around the time of the 2004 conference, where because amongst the many and various issues that were discussed, gay rights was one of them, even back then. The press kind of presented it, the Kampala press presented it as a conference of gays and atheists, and this was terrible. But so again, that was mixed up with the homosexuality issue. Certainly someone socially sort of saying to their family or their village or neighbours or something openly and proudly, I am an atheist, I don't believe in God. If that's rightly understood, I don't mean in the sense of people just not understanding the word. I mean it can be hard to convey to someone who either hasn't heard that word before or has only heard it with an absolutely negative connotation, to someone to actually use it of themselves as if it's a neutral, this is a statement of my view, and to say in response to the question, what religion are you? Like, none, I don't have one. It can be really, really hard for people to grasp. But if it is grasped, then it can be quite a negative response, and you know, some families would throw people out, or you know, but they are functioning as a humanist organisation. They've been able to register, which wasn't the case in Nigeria, for example. There's been a Nigerian humanist movement there for some years, but they haven't been able to formally register as an organisation. So in some ways they're better there than Malawi or Nigeria, where as humanists they're sort of immediately, that the word has a negative connotation because it's closely associated with atheism.
Yeah. think Jeremy's about to.
Yes, I know there are more questions out there, but we've reached the witching hour. Bob will turn into a pumpkin if you're not careful. So, we must stop there. But I'd like to thank Bob, not only for stepping into the breach so quickly, but for giving us such a fascinating evening, and I've certainly learnt a lot from it. It really puts a lot of our issues into perspective, doesn't it? So thanks very much, Bob.